YouTube. So let me do that, and then I'll share my screen and we'll get started. Hopefully you can see me a little bit. I know it's a little dark here. The sun just went down, but hopefully you can see me. As always, if you have any questions, let me know by typing it into the chat box. Okay, so I'm seeing what I look like on YouTube here. Let me turn the audio off and we'll get started. Okay, very good. So let me pull up the chat box. So let's see here. Okay. I know I can't brighten it up, David, unfortunately, because I'm in the lobby, but I'm going to be sharing my screen and then you'll be able to see that. So let me go to sharing my screen. And you should see now everything should be brightened and we'll get started. All right. I see some more people have come in. Welcome. And okay. And actually, I'm probably brighter too because my screen is brighter. So let me brighten my screen up a little bit. Great. Okay, so as I said, I feel like there is a way of thinking about your own health journey and your healing when it comes to thinking about it from the conception of a Judeo-Christian source. And we're going to be dividing this talk into really 3 sections. And I should say that the ideas behind this class really come from two basic sources. The first is my teacher, who I studied with for many years. His name was Dr. Gerald Epstein, and he wrote an amazing article in a journal, medical journal, that he entitled Hebraic Medicine. And a lot of this section of the class actually comes from a lot of his writings, where he spent a lot of time distinguishing between the ideas of the East and the ideas of the West. There is a very clear distinction between how to think about your overall health when it comes to looking at it from an Eastern perspective versus a Western perspective. The Eastern perspective sort of looks at the world as kind of as he would describe as sort of an illusion, and that we need to correct our thinking about that in a way to better understand ourselves. In the Western view, the world is very real, and that we need to embrace the world, to sort of fight with the world in a sense, to correct the world. And that's sort of the path of the West, that we don't retreat into the mountains and meditate in a cave. There's certainly a value to that, of course, but in the West, we take what's presented to us by the world, we interpret it, and filter it through the conceptions that we learn from our traditions, and then we are forced to make decisions, and we need to learn how to preserve that choice. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about how it's important for you to take upon yourselves the decisions in your life. I always say that my goal is for you to become your own authority in health. And what I really mean by that is what we're going to be talking about tonight, that you actually have a responsibility to make these decisions for yourself. Now, it doesn't mean at all that you don't listen to doctors or experts. What it means is that you know yourself better than anyone else, and that you need to learn how to, of course, find experts, but ultimately the decision lies with you. And if you're pushing the decision onto an external person or an external whatever, then you are violating something that we will talk about as we go through the class. So I entitled this basically the Judeo-Christian concept of time and health, because the notions of time in secular culture are very different from the conception of time in the Bible. And when we fall for the modern secular conception of time, it actually deprives us of a sense of freedom. And I think you'll understand what I mean by that as we go through the class. So let's start with marking time. And this could get complicated, so I'm probably going to simplify this as best as I can. As I was looking at this before I went on, I thought, oh boy, I really need to, I don't want this to turn into sort of a dense philosophical discussion. So I'll make it as as simple as I possibly can by breaking it down into 3 different conceptions of time. It just seems like, we don't necessarily think about time. We wake up, the day progresses, and, we get older year by year, and we have this conception of how we mark time, and we don't think that there's necessarily another way to think about time. But when you look at history and how history has been recorded, different cultures and different traditions look at time in very, very different ways. So before the Bible, the people would mark times based on cycles, and it would be a cyclical type of time where there was the seasons, and there were years would pass, birth and death, and it was like a closed circle. There was nothing new that was there. It was essentially a very fatalistic view of society, of life, and it was dictated by nature, and you didn't escape from nature. There was nothing about you that was beyond nature. And this progressed into, or I should say was carried through Nietzsche, who was a very influential philosopher, who basically said that he argued that time was infinite, but matter is finite, and therefore everything that could happen already did happen. So in other words, the focus here is that there is a conception of time that is fatalistic, that there's nothing that you can do about that. Of course, the biblical view is very, very different than that, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Modern secular views on time are that it's a linear-based time. In other words, things progress from one thing to the next. And generally speaking, this linear conception of time is one that you go from one thing to another, and with science, everything continues to progress in one continuous, unbroken advance. But as one rabbi said, this sort of deletes, he quote, deletes the work of redemption and replaces it with the word progress. So it's sort of a secularization of a view on time that basically replaces God with this notion of progress. Now, obviously, the limitations on this are obvious, because just because science progresses doesn't mean that life and the meaning of life and healing and whatever you want to say are going to be progressing. In fact, that's not the case, because we know that things happen, that as one particular person that I'll talk about in just a second, but we know that unrestrained technology is destroying life on the planet. So there is a limitation here to think that time progresses and things continually get better. As one historian said, progress seems less compelling when it appears that it may progress into an abyss. And we all know that as we talk about environmental disaster and not having a conception of, the limits of science, that we can really lead ourselves into a situation where we don't recognize the impacts on our health. I mean, GMOs come to mind, modern industrial, thinking about how technology is used to raise cattle, as an example. These sorts of things are outside of not taking into account the limits of life by sort of utilizing science. So we know that progress from a scientific perspective is not necessarily going to lead us where we want. So what's another way of looking at time? Well, the Bible basically interprets time in a different way. It's what one rabbi by the name of Jonathan Sachs, who also inspired a fair amount of this talk, spoke about it as covenantal time. And this is obviously the distinction of marking time through a covenant with God. My teacher, Gerald Epstein, would say that it's spiral. In other words, yes, it goes in a circular fashion, but it's not a closed circle. You can continually progress and elevate and move up this spiral. But essentially, this is a different way of looking at time. And in this particular view of time, we have choice, that history is not an endless series of recurrences, and we are not in a linear time-based view that we are in some sort of, continuous progression of time, that science is going to make everything better. And we may mark time by nature, but ultimately it can be an endless spiral of progression upwards. And essentially the distinction here is that, that one view is basically fatalist. In other words, there's nothing you can do about it. The next view is that there is potentially optimism, that science progresses, but it could potentially be sort of a false optimism. But the Bible speaks not necessarily of optimism, but of hope. And there's this great quote that I wanted to share with you. And this is from Rabbi Sachs as well. And this really typifies what the Bible's view on the matter is. And that is that optimism is the belief that things will get better. Hope is the belief that together we can make things better. Optimism is a passive virtue. Hope is an active one. It takes no courage, only a certain naivete to be an optimist. It takes great courage to sustain hope. So the time conception of the world is very important in this case as we go into the next part of what I'm talking about. And this notion that you need to be courageous to have hope also puts on you the necessity to actually make decisions for yourself. And this is how this is how you materialize hope, that you make the choice to, that you take great courage to basically sustain this hope with the faith that with the faith in God, essentially. So we'll move on now to the next section because I think that this conception of, we don't necessarily think about how time is, how we think about time. We don't talk about that too much, but I think seeing the distinction between how the Bible speaks of time, how history speaks of time, and how science speaks of time really points to something very, very different that allows us to think in hopeful terms, but one that also, again, puts upon us the necessity to make choices. And that theme is going to sort of run through what we're going to be talking about tonight. So we've come to this idea that we actually need to be the ones in control of our own health destiny. But ultimately, that, as we said, there is a certain courage to be able to do that. And there are certain stumbling blocks that occur along the way that prevent us from making those decisions for ourselves. We've already spoken about how the prevailing secular scientific view actually, in some ways, prevents us from being our own authority, for taking control over our health destiny. And so some of these stumbling blocks, one of the stumbling blocks is when we decide that we are going to be free and free to be able to make decisions for ourselves. That can be a very scary situation, because there is a certain security when you, let's say, go to a doctor and you just sort of cede complete control over to the doctor because of uncertainty or whatever the case may be, or just the feeling that you're really not in control, and that there is something and someone better than you to be able to make those decisions. Ultimately, again, you need to be the one to make the final decision. And this sort of loss of security and predictability is you enter this world of uncertainty. And it may not even be something that you're conscious of. It could just be the comfort of ceding control to somebody else. And essentially, this is depriving yourself of freedom when you do that. And we are called to be free. And that's what the Bible speaks of, is that we are meant to be free. That's the whole story of the Exodus, is the calling to be free, our right to be free. But with freedom comes this loss of security and predictability. And quite frankly, in Hebrew, the word emunah, which means faith, doesn't actually mean certainty. It means the courage to live with uncertainty, basically. This is what Rabbi Sachs discusses. So faith is something that you need to have. It's courage. And it's courage to live with that uncertainty, but we are called to be our own authority and to be making those choices for ourselves. The point is that you don't make those choices by yourself. Of course you do them. You do those decisions with God. And the decisions that you make here, before we go on, is that a lot of times we set a distinction, we set a goal. And there's a distinction between goals and aims. They're very, very important. And you'll understand it even deeper when we speak about a little bit more about the Ten Commandments. But a goal is a fixed destination. This is like a fixed image. And we can have a certain destination where we want to go. But unfortunately, if it's a fixed image where we feel like we know exactly where we want to go, unfortunately, we are not in a position to be able to make that firm decision. In other words, it's sort of like an idol. And when you're making this fixed image, you have to ultimately let go and realize that the end result, you don't have control over that end result. But if your goal is so fixed, and then you're not really allowing God to be part of this journey that you're on. So the distinction is instead of focusing on goals, is to focusing on an aim. And an aim is just a direction. You set this direction and you leave the end result to God. Of course, you can move and you can course correct as things go on. But the distinction here is really one that is biblically based because, again, we are looking for, we can certainly point ourselves in a direction, but if we're continuously focused on getting to this one particular place, well, that might not be the place that God wants you to necessarily go. We can continue to course correct. We can set the direction with the notion that we're making decisions that are improving, that are bringing more life into your life, choosing life. And those are the main distinctions between making a goal and making an aim. Okay. So the next is a refusal to act. So, ultimately, this is all coming down to the situation where the Bible really wants to preserve your freedom at all costs. This is, again, the story of the Exodus. It runs through the entire Bible that we have an enormous responsibility for ourselves to act. And if we put anything before us that is a violation of the first commandment, to not put anything before God. And most people don't bring this notion into the conception about our health. And we're constantly called to choose life. We can, in Deuteronomy it says choose life or death. Choose life or death. And every single decision of every single day is either a life-affirming decision or life-denying decision. And you are called to make that choice. And so this relates directly to your health destiny. It could be as simple as, a choice of food. Is this food a life-affirming choice or a life-denying choice? We're constantly called to make these choices. And if we don't make those choices, then we are either allowing other people to make the choice or we're allowing doubt to enter into our lives. And if that happens, then essentially, your health is going to suffer. An example from the New Testament, of course, is in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus says, say yes or no, everything else is from evil. And what he's saying there is that you have to make a choice. You have to say yes or no. If you don't say yes or no, then he's saying that it's coming from evil. So the message of the Bible is that we have absolutely, thinking about it from a historical perspective, an absolute responsibility to continually make choices that favor giving your life more life. And so these stumbling blocks that I speak about are this next one is the refusal to act. The third is making reckless decisions. And of course, in this particular case, if we're focusing on what Deuteronomy says to choose life, then it really simplifies things for us that, we ultimately have to make the choice. You might make the wrong choice, but again, we can always course correct, and we can proceed on to making healthful decisions for ourselves. The next stumbling block is falling into utopian thinking. And honestly, this sort of falls into the goal versus aim thinking, because if we tend to think about some sort of, it has to be this way, we're focusing on something that is almost too ideal. Whenever utopian thinking has been incorporated into the past, politically speaking, it's led to mass murder, because quite frankly, there is no utopia. The Bible is not one to foster utopia. It's an incremental spiral, you could say, movement that is going up and it's going down. It's not one particularly direct thing. And in fact, there's a lot of utopian thinking that's going into health these days. So an example would be, someone who's on, say, a raw vegan diet. They're not using science necessarily. They're using this just sort of ideal conception in their head that if it's raw and it's vegan, that it must be good. But there's no particular science that is in. They just sort of think that this is the way to do it, and that anytime anyone says to you that there's a certain way or a certain diet to a shortcut to your health and to wholeness, then that is essentially probably not actually a shortcut. In fact, most of the time, in life, we realize that these shortcuts are never shortcuts. They are often detours, in fact. And we realize that the work of, slowly progressing towards health is one that has a whole host of stumbling blocks. There's a quote that I like from the Talmud, and I'll just say it really quick. And that is, it says, "Once a child got the better of me. I was traveling and I met with a child on the crossroads. I asked him, 'Which way to the city?' And he replied, 'This way is short and long, and that way is long and short.' I took the short and long way. I soon reached the city, but found my approach obstructed by gardens and orchards. So I retraced my steps and said to the child, 'My son, did you not tell me that this is the short way?' Answered the child, 'Did I not tell you that it is also long?'" I happen to like that. And I think it really explains, sort of in a little parable, that whenever anyone offers you a shortcut to health, you have to realize that, one, potentially they're falling into some sort of utopian thinking, and two, potentially they're depriving you of your own story. In other words, we all have sort of this slow journey towards health and to holiness, because honestly, my teacher Gerald Epstein used to remind people all the time that the word for health, healing, and holiness come from the same root. So this progression of deciding to be healthy and whole is also a holy path. And by looking into the Bible, into the mindset of the Bible, that allows us to make these decisions in a more, I think, more sane fashion, a healthier fashion, when we can incorporate the idea, especially that health, wholeness, and holiness are really all part of the same progression. And now that doesn't mean that you're not holy. There are plenty of holy people that have dealt with all kinds of illness. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that this journey, where you are progressing on a path towards holiness, is really, it's not inconsistent with the path of becoming a healthier individual, both mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, whatever, how all of the dimensions of your being. And to always remember this idea that we are, each of us has a narrative, a story that is progressing, and we are the main character in that story. And that's why, understanding how time was marked, where we had no freedom, where people didn't have a narrative. They had very firm expectations of living, short and miserable lives without hope or any of that sort. The Bible comes along and says, no, we are obligated in a radical way to make these decisions for ourselves. When we don't do that, we are not living up to the amazing gift that God has given us to have the ability to make choices. So let's move on to what my teacher called Hebraic medicine, and it really is it's carried through, of course, into Christianity and the conception of the right of the individual to be able to make decisions and choices for themselves. Now, the Bible doesn't speak of physicians at all. It speaks of healers. And the difference is something that I think you'll understand by the end of the class tonight. The East the East speaks of, as I said at the beginning, the East sort of speaks of the world as an illusion, generally speaking. We don't see it that way. We see it as something to be interacted with and to grow through, and we're presented with things that allow us to grow. So we're not bound by linear time. We know that. So cause and effect are less important when it comes to thinking about medicine from the medical thinking from the Bible. And of course, this is evidenced by spontaneous cures through prayer, because that is not a linear-based type of healing. It also conceives of illness as an expression of how one lives, with an emphasis on sort of the moral, ethical living. But ultimately, it's about choice. It's the preeminence of choice. And as we said in Deuteronomy, it says, choose life. So one of the biggest things that you can think about is that we are commanded by the Bible to choose life. And we don't realize that, again, to repeat what I said before, it's just so important that we are presented at every moment of every second of every day to choose life. And every decision in our life, we can see it as, again, either life affirming or life denying. And you either say yes or you say no, just like Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. You must make that choice. And my teacher, Jerry, used to call the 10 Commandments the law of balance. And I'd like to go through those in just a moment. I think I'm going to save that for near the end, just because I think it's a interesting way of sort of closing tonight's class. The doctor-patient relationship, thinking biblically, is that it's advice, the distinction between advice and choice. In other words, a healer basically preserves the choice of the patient. That is what a healer does. Now, many of you know that, many of you have probably experienced going to a physician and maybe disagreeing or not wanting to go down a certain path for whatever the case may be. And oftentimes the doctor will become very irate, will be angry. And the distinction here is that a healer has to actually preserve the choice of the patient. And when I learned this, I learned it from my teacher, of course. This was actually a little difficult for me, because if I'm choosing life and I want to give my patients the most health, but as I said, everyone is on their own journey, and we need to honor the journey that they're on, that healing journey. So the patient has to be free to take responsibility for him and herself. And as a healer, that can be very difficult, because sometimes they can choose not to choose life. But we have to honor that, because the doctor is not there to be a moral arbiter. He's there to preserve the freedom of the patient. And as an example, that, when someone asked me to give an example of that, is I had a patient who was suffering from just awful eczema. She had eczema since she was a kid, covered pretty much head to toe. She was around 30 pounds overweight. was eating poorly, and she agreed to, change her diet. And she did that for 6 weeks, and she came back and she was completely clear for the first time in her life. She'd lost around 20 pounds, at least. And, and it was wonderful. And then I saw her around a month later, and she'd gained a great deal of the weight back, and her eczema was back. And she just said that, she was getting so much pressure from her family because of her eating that she would just rather, try medicines that never worked for her, and in this case, initially, yeah, of course, I'm sad for that situation. But again, it's not my, as a doctor, healer, whatever you want to call it, it's not my response. I shouldn't be the moral arbiter of that choice. I can certainly, extol the virtues of continuing to make those choices. But if the decision is made, then the doctor needs to honor those decisions, because, as we said, this person has made a choice, and that needs to be honored. The next concept is that the healer is only an agent of the divine, which means that if a doctor tells you that you have 6 months to live, he's projecting himself into the future, and we have no right, as people who, if you believe in the Bible, we have no right to project ourselves into the future. We let God decide the future. So if anyone tries to forecast the future, that's just not something that is going to be good for anyone. For one, it can have what's called a nocebo effect, which is basically, we all know about the placebo effect. Placebo effect, of course, is, when you give something that isn't actually medicine, but people improve. Well, you can also have a nocebo effect where just by saying something like this, it can cause your immune system to degrade, and it can end up actually shortening your life. So in this case, there's no question that you can ask any doctor who has been in a situation where they've had patients who've heard the words, "You have 6 months to live," and like on the 6th month, they pretty much die. Now, that is not the doctor that's not the doctor seeing into the future that the person has 6 months to live. It's often the person, basically swallowing that whole and accepting that he has 6 months to live, which basically means that he's programming his body to leave in 6 months. And there's no question, you can see, this degradation in the immune system starts to degrade, and they end up dying. So quite frankly, no one knows. You can never predict the future. And when anyone decides to try to predict the future for you, that is not their responsibility. And as we said, we as people who, or if anyone who's listening has faith in biblical teachings, know that our goal, our obligation is to have hope beyond anything. And hope, of course, as we have reminded everyone, is a courageous act. And we are called to be courageous in this setting. And it's true, maybe in that circumstance, you might not, I just continue using this example because it's so morbid. But ultimately, I think what I'm trying to say is that anytime anyone puts themselves between you and God and decides that they feel like they can predict the future, from a biblical perspective, you have to realize that is not proper, that those people are trying to take the knowledge and power of God, which obviously is not in their realm to do. So when we talk about ethics, and we spoke about how in what we could call Hebraic medicine, this notion that the conception of illness is an expression of how one lives, with an emphasis on a moral, ethical living, we have to also understand that ethics in this instance also means taking care of, that being ethical towards oneself means taking care of oneself. And we often, especially in circumstances where we have family and such, or other obligations, we don't take care of ourselves, that we put others before ourselves. And this is something that women are more guilty of than men, because they take care of the family so much that they sometimes neglect themselves. But we are called, men and women, to in this case, and speaking about it in a different way, being ethical towards ourselves, which means taking care of ourselves and seeing yourself as a sacred vessel. That you, of course, a mother feels a sacred responsibility to take care of her family, but also have to realize that your body is also a sacred vessel that needs to be taken care of, so that you can do the things that you want to do. And as the sort of the meme that you sort of see on social media, I think it says something like, self-care is not selfish, or something like that. I've seen that quote floating around over the last couple months, and that's true. That another just way of thinking about it, again, is thinking about it from an ethical perspective. That another way of thinking ethically is to think ethically towards yourself, and that is basically taking care of yourself. So there is this notion, of course, in that really when you think about, gurus, health gurus and such, they often take this from Eastern sort of medicine, where they talk about how the mind and the body are connected. Well, this is also biblical, of course, because in biblical thinking, there is always a connection between the mind and the body. But in biblical thinking, oftentimes there's often an ethical dimension as well as an emotional dimension that sort of go hand in hand. And so when we're looking at ourselves, we need to realize that, we exist on all these different levels. We have a physical and emotional, and we also have a social aspect to our lives. And these relational and connections that we have can really be a source of stress and illness, but also, an incredible liberation of health as well. So we need to think of illness in a little bit of a different way, biblically, but still with the notion that there is this connection between the mind and the body. Life force energy, every tradition around the world has it. In India, they call it prana. In China, they call it chi. And in the Hebraic model, it's called nefesh, which is in Judaism is the lowest part of your soul. It's the part that animates your body. And it says that in the Bible that this nefesh sort of runs with the blood, which sort of approximates the chi in China, which has these meridians that run through it. So it's obviously not an exact, but it still has this notion that we have this sort of vital energy, and that the vital energy diminishes if we don't take care of ourselves in the proper way. So I'd like to go through now the 10 Commandments, and looking at them at a different way, and then we'll end tonight's class. So my teacher, Dr. Gerald Epstein, used to call them the laws of balance. And the reason why I find it important is because, most illness, almost all illness, is essentially an imbalance. And when we can think about our lives in an ethical fashion, in terms of recovering balance and identifying imbalance, then we have another really clear path towards improving our health. So let's start with the first commandment, which is putting no other gods before me. Now, this one's an interesting one because what I'm going to be doing here is looking at them from a different conception, not like the conception that maybe you learned in your after school class, religious class, or your Sunday school, or whatever the case may be, but looking at them from a social, moral perspective, and trying to identify a certain balance or imbalance in your life. So some of these are going to be ideas that maybe you haven't thought about the 10 Commandments in this way. We've gone through this commandment already in this class tonight. We spoke about how you cannot place faith in any authority, such as a doctor, as an ultimate authority. In other words, you can't put anything between you and God. That means that anyone you consider to be better or higher than you is putting someone else before putting someone between you and God, which would be a violation of this first commandment. And unfortunately, we do this all the time. From a health perspective, we often do put the doctor in between us and God. And we can still use and consult with great doctors, but we also have to acknowledge that God is the ultimate healer, and that we need to make sure that we're not putting anyone before God. And of course, again, this is a radical conception in the sense of forcing us to make a choice and learn what we need to learn in order to make sure that we don't need to put anyone before us. Again, I'm not saying you don't go to a doctor or we believe, of course, we all believe in science and science's power, the power of science to heal us, but we ultimately have to realize that God is the ultimate healer, and learn to make those choices for ourselves. Of course, putting celebrities and gurus and before you, as if they're somehow higher on some sort of level is also not allowed. Whether that's, even a holy man, they can be a source of inspiration, but they are not to be placed between you and God. I put in here that one of the ways that you do this is typified in this sort of thinking about prayer as like as an example. So I call it, my teacher called it second order prayer. And what he meant by that is that one could pray to God to say, please, dear God, please heal me. That would be called what's called the first order prayer. And really that, there's nothing wrong with that prayer, but another way to say that prayer is to make it a second order prayer, which basically says something to the effect of, God, please give me the strength and to find the necessary information to help me heal. And the distinction between these is that you are, again, taking on that radical responsibility that between you and God, that God will help you to be able to become your own authority to make those decisions. And whenever we're praying to God, we should really think about it from that perspective, that we are given this remarkable birthright to be able to make the decisions for ourselves. We need to always remind ourselves of that. And when we are praying to God, we should think about it in that conception, that we hope that God gives us the strength, the knowledge, whatever the case may be, to make those decisions. So that's another way of thinking about the first commandment. The second commandment is no idol worship, which goes with a little bit of what we spoke about earlier, in the sense of not thinking that there is some sort of person greater than us or closer, to God, but also it's thinking about a fixed destination. We spoke about that when it comes to making goals. But ultimately, when we make conclusions, firm conclusions, we're also shutting out the possibility of the future. If we made this firm decision or conclusion about something, then we don't necessarily even hear other possibilities. And this is considered a form of idol worship, because you have basically eliminated God from the end result. And we need to basically make sure that we don't do that. So we always need to remain open to things, casting people into special roles that they shouldn't necessarily be in. Again, we spoke about that already as well. So this is, again, we're thinking about the Ten Commandments in a very different way. Taking God's name in vain. One way of doing that is asking ourselves, who are we serving? Are we motivated by love and being considerate, or not? That's another way of taking God's name in vain, just a different way of conceiving it. Honoring the Sabbath. The Sabbath is a day that, of course, the Bible has this notion of the Sabbath. And what's interesting about the Sabbath is that it's a way of escaping time, where we're constantly in this, the world forces us into this closed circle of thinking. And on the Sabbath, in addition to restoring your vitality, you're also escaping time, where you don't have to work and you don't have to try to, change everything. It's just a place for you to rest and to remember yourself. My teacher used to say that remembering, is remembering, is putting yourself back together again. And that's another way to remember yourself, is to take this time out each week. I mean, this is, such a fundamental part of the Bible. It's mentioned so many times that in the Old Testament, there's so many, penalties to violating the Sabbath. Why would that be? It's looking at it from the outside, you think to yourself, well, that sounds almost strange. I mean, a day where you don't work and you rest and such. So the question I guess I would ask everyone, sorry about that, is can you incorporate a day where you are, remembering, putting yourself back together again and restoring your vitality, and not at war with the world, not in the work type of frame of mind. That's another way of thinking about it. And I can say that, this is something that I do every Saturday. I turn my computer off and I rest. And I would encourage everyone to consider, it doesn't have to be on Saturday or Sunday, but one day a week, you should really think about that. And from a Jewish perspective, of course, there's a really famous quote that says that it's not that the Jews kept the Sabbath, it's that the Sabbath kept the Jews. So it's a fundamental, aspect to, restoring a sense of balance in your life. The next is honoring your parents. We're getting up near the end of the hour, so we'll go through these pretty quickly. It's interesting, that modern psychology is basically obsessed with this idea that the parents are responsible for the trauma of the child, and that the child is therefore given this, lifelong obsession with trying to deal with the trauma that their parents caused. It sort of allows the modern psychology, the kid to have this never-ending war mentally with trying to recuperate from the trauma that that their parents caused, and this causes an incredible imbalance. But the reason I want to put this in here is that it doesn't say to love your parents, but to honor them. And so the Bible, in its wisdom, realized that there would be tensions between parents and kids, but ultimately, as it says here, by honoring one's parents for giving them life, they're given the opportunity to serve God and society, to fill the highest purpose, namely to recognize self as emanating from the divine parent. There may not be any love between parents and children, but there must be respect and mutual honoring of their human status in the great chain of being. So ultimately, modern psychology doesn't really feel that way. And the Bible, again, in its wisdom, realized that it's not love, but honoring the opportunity at life. That is what is called upon. Okay, so not murdering. Of course, that makes sense, but can you murder someone in another way? And the answer is that yes. One way you murder someone is humiliating them. That is murdering their name, is another way of murdering them. Of course, these are just other ways of thinking about the laws of balance, the Ten Commandments. Not giving credit to your sources is another way that has been interpreted as a type of murder against someone. And even depression, which of course sometimes is unavoidable, is considered a type of self-murder. Now, obviously, depression can be something that is very difficult to deal with. But in Judaic, Hebraic teachings, the war against depression is spoken about at length. That it says that the divine presence doesn't rest on someone who is depressed. Not that God is no longer with you, but that we always need to be wary and vigilant about becoming depressed. Adultery, another way of thinking about that is that there is bringing in the presence of a third party. Like the idea, the conception of this would be the serpent in the Garden of Eden. It's that third voice that's coming in. We need to make sure that we don't allow a third party to interrupt, the relationship we have between us and God. And when we do that, we weaken the relationship. And adultery, actually in English, the root means to weaken, and to mix things that don't belong as well as another definition. So we don't want to bring on sort of a third party into the relationship that we have between us and God. And of course, we've spoken about that at length tonight in tonight's class. Stealing, one way that you can steal from someone is stealing their time, is saying that you'll call them tomorrow, and or letting them wait for this sort of thing. Now, all of these ways of thinking about these 10 commandments is ways of just making sure that we are paying attention to things that are going to put us morally in an imbalanced situation. Bearing false witness, one other way of thinking about that is thinking about the future, and making sort of becoming obsessed with things in the future that we don't know about. That anything you say about the future is a lie. You do not know what the future is, and you don't know what your health future is. And again, the doctor saying that you're going to be dead in 6 months, or making false, prognosis that is somehow in the future. These are all ways of bearing false witness. Coveting also denotes enslaving or removing freedom of others. So, a lot of times people have they have excessive ownership. In other words, you'll have patients who come in and they'll talk about my cancer and my illness and my psoriasis, my this, my that. Ultimately, in those situations, the disease becomes part of their identity. They are almost seeing themselves in their identity as owning it. Their idea is becoming part of their identity. Ultimately, we need to cease ownership of these things. And ultimately, when we do that, we often find ways to improve those things as well. There's many others here that I'm actually going to skip, but ultimately this coveting is defined sort of nicely here as the desire to take, keep, advance, and hold on to something at the expense of others. And to reverse this, we can reverse that by sharing and giving without a desire to get. That's one way of thinking about it. And ultimately, it requires a trust. As my teacher said, it requires a trust that we will not be deprived of what we need if we let go of what we own. In other words, we always have to realize that by ceasing ownership of those things that don't serve us, we're not going to be deprived of what we need, because we believe in God being able to provide for us. And when we don't do that, again, it's a violation of this sort of 10th law of balance. So that's what I wanted to cover. A little deeper, I guess, than some of the things that I've spoken about before, and didn't know if this would come together. I hope it did for you. There's no test at the end of this particular class like I've been doing over the last month or so. And, if you have any comments, please do include them in the chat box. Hopefully, there have been some quotes. Oh, some things here as wow. There have been a lot of comments here that I'm sorry I didn't see. So I'll go through some of these before a bunch of messages coming in. Oh, that's nice. So let me make some comments here. So thank you, David, for that. And Maureen's asking if she can view this presentation again. And the answer is yes, it's being recorded on YouTube. And thank you, David, for saying that. That's very touching. The slides are available. I can send this to you, Maureen, if you wanted to send me an email at jonathan@miraclenoodle.com. can send that to you. So Ron is asking, if a person has cancer and doctor recommends surgery or else die and explains options and the person opts out, he is taking control and leaves it up to God. Are you saying that if he has a positive attitude, then cancer can subside and go away? No, I'm not saying that at all, actually. What I'm saying is that ultimately you need to become your own authority to be able to to understand the positives and negatives of that particular procedure, and that if you feel that that doctor has been sent your way, to be the agent of healing and feels authentically like that person is an agent of healing from God, then ultimately, of course, then it is your obligation to get that surgery. This is what it means to become your own authority in health. Now, it is possible for someone with cancer to say that they don't want to have the surgery and that they're going to leave it up to God. That would be most of the time a situation where they're making not a life-affirming decision, thinking about it. But again, each situation is different. So I'm not at all suggesting that by becoming your own authority that somehow God is going to heal you. You might be making just a bad decision. So good question. Again, thank you, David. And please, I'll put my email address here into the box. Let me type it here. If anyone wants to reach out to me. And if anyone has any questions, let me know. Thank you, Terry, for saying that. And that's it, I guess. Thank you so much for your attention. We came up to the hour, and again, I really appreciate your patience and interest in something a little bit different. Next week we'll actually be going back to. Next week we'll be talking about a hormone called adiponectin, which is just another hormone that a lot of people don't think about, and when you actually understand it, it gives you a little bit more inspiration to realize that some of the decisions, some of the dietary suggestions that you hear a lot about are valid because you understand this concept of adiponectin. So totally, completely a different type of topic, but I appreciate everyone's patience in trying to do something a little bit different tonight, and I'm glad that I received all these positive comments. And I thank you for your attention. I wish everyone a good night, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Good night, everyone.